So, hi, I'm Irene Harris. My first name is Jeanette. You can't tell that from any of the materials, but it keeps putting my first name on everything, but I go by Irene, and please, you don't have to call me Dr. Just call me Irene today. I was doing this training once for a group of, I think they were Air Force chaplains, and they were in the UK. And as I got done with the training, the lead chaplain in that group said, you know, there's a poem by Rumi that encapsulates everything that you just taught us all day. Like, if I could just take a whole day's training and encapsulate it in one poem, let's do this. There it is on the screen. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. So let me tell you about what I do on a day-to-day basis at work. Monday and Tuesday, I go to clinic and I treat veterans who are managing moral injury syndrome. I've been with the VA for 21 years and I probably have treated at least 300 vets with this. Wednesday through Friday, I work on research. So there are a lot of people doing research in this field. There are a lot of people doing clinical work in this field. There are not that many people out there doing both. But usually when folks come into my clinic, they come in with a fairly rigidly held idea that I have done something wrong or somebody else has done something wrong. And I start asking a whole lot of questions about context. And one of the things that we found out was that it wasn't necessarily right or wrong, that the individual was in a moral dilemma. There was nothing they were going to do in that situation where they would wind up feeling like they were right at the end of the day. And that is why this poem encapsulates a lot of what we're trying to get done in building spiritual strength. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. So I've been introduced already. I'm old. I've been doing this a long time. I am a VA employee, so I have to tell you, if I stand up here today and say something stupid, I say it on my own. The VA is not going to back me up. In here, there it is. I missed that. So Chaplain Tomberlin, who has worked with me for about 10 years, and he is going to, we do some role plays today, and he's going to be the veteran for me today. MDiv, D-Min, has worked as a chaplain in the military, in the Bureau of Prisons, and the VA. So when I ask him to show me examples of externalizing moral injury with people who are angry and don't trust their providers and challenging to work with, he does the best job of anyone I've ever. All right. So,
hey, Irene, can you give the phone here?
Okay.
Then the camera.
That maybe it won't be unfair to our virtual folks.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, perfect. Thanks.
VA. Usually when I'm talking with folks who work in the VA, they're like, please don't show us 3 slides about post-traumatic stress disorder. We work with this all the time. Is there anybody here who needs the slides on post-traumatic stress disorder? Okay, we'll just, I like when I have small classes because we can customize the training to be close. So moral injury, I am going to take the time to define because all of you obviously have some command of what moral injury is. You wouldn't have come to the conference if you had. But I'm still going to define it because there are about 12 different recognized definitions of moral injury floating around the literature right now. So just to keep us on the same page, I'm going to talk about what I'm thinking about when I think of moral injury. So this is drawn largely from the Bratlitt's 2007. I have a few tweaks in the wording. The psychological and behavioral sequelae of experiences that challenge our deeply held moral, spiritual, and values-related feelings. So the term moral injury has a lot of traction now in the healthcare field, the mental health field, the chaplaincy field, etc. People know what it is. It's useful shorthand, provider to provider. I'm working with this veteran who clearly seems to have moral injury syndrome. One of the things that I sadly learned the hard way, I was telling Steve this morning, what I've put in this presentation is all the mistakes I've made practicing treating moral injuries. Here's one of them. It's not at all unusual for me to use the word moral injury for the first time in a veteran's life and to watch that veteran, geez. I've only made the mistake twice. I never did it again after twice. So many veterans, when they hear the phrase moral injury, they hear my provider thinks that I am having symptoms because I did something that was immoral. And veterans often hear injury as permanent disability, compensation, etc. So the message they think they're hearing is I'm now permanently disabled because I did something that was wrong. It is not how I want to start a counseling relationship at all. So different ways that I talk about this with veterans. Again, I will use the term moral injury with you folks all day, but with veterans, if the veteran comes in with language for this problem that they use that they're comfortable with, I will go to that veteran's language. I work with a veteran right now who uses the words deep. That's the language I use with him. That's actually the language I put in notes. Mostly so they don't forget what language I use. With veterans who don't come in with verbiage for what they're experiencing, if they identify as spiritual, my usual go-to is, are you experiencing spiritual distress? And gosh, spiritual distress sounds way more recoverable than moral injury. And it kind of sounds like a compliment, like I'm a spiritual person and I'm thinking carefully about my spirituality. For those who don't identify as spiritual, I will often ask them, is what you're experiencing values-related distress, some kind of values conflict? And most veterans will be comfortable with some kind of language in that realm. So when I'm working with veterans, that's the language that I use. There's some controversy in the field as to whether we stay with the term moral injury that has traction in the research literature or whether we look for better language. So I've let you know where my camp is on that, but I am just one person, so I can shovel the sand that's in my sandbox. Most of you are probably familiar with this. How did you know you were talking with somebody who is managing moral injury syndrome? There's a lot of different ways to experience this and talk about this, and because it's not codified as a diagnosis yet, person to person, veteran to veteran, there's a lot of differences in definition. One key thing is the person's assumptions about the world, their spiritual beliefs, their basic values have collapsed on them, and they may be struggling with previous beliefs. How many of you have heard the phrase God died on the battlefield that day? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's often if there is a higher power in this individual's life, there's some sort of struggle or conflict in the relationship with the higher power. I have often worked with clients who were very forgiving, patient people, like high school special ed teachers specializing in autism, who go from being like the most patient people in the world to yelling at their spouses in church because they picked up a jacket for them. And you got to put that in context. You just can't come back from 18 months of deployment. We put weapons and ammo in jackets. A missing jacket is freaking scary. But this man came to me in tears, like, what is the matter with me that I would do something like that? So people, even people who have values on forgiveness and practice forgiveness well, suddenly find themselves not being able to do that. Loss of meaning or purpose in life. The old set of assumptions has often collapsed. What's your life's purpose? What are your goals? What are you doing with your life if the set of assumptions on which you had built your life cease to make sense? Reduced trust in self or others. So there are many kinds of moral injury, but one of the ways we define them is as internalizing moral injury. I feel like I've done something wrong that I ordinarily don't think I would have ever done. I no longer trust myself to act in a trustworthy and morally responsible manner. So I don't trust myself, so I start to withdraw from relationships. The other presentation is what I call externalizing moral injury. I don't trust other people to act in a trustworthy or socially responsible manner. So because I don't trust anybody else, I withdraw from relationships. Either way, we've got somebody pulling away from all of their social support. There's one thing that predicts positive mental health outcomes, no matter if we're talking about depression, PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, learning disabilities, etc., social support. And this syndrome talks people into drawing away from one of the best resources they could have to recover. And then the hallmark symptom that most people are aware of is inappropriate shame and guilt or inappropriate anger. So how many people have been counseling a veteran and they come in saying, I did this horrible thing wrong, and you talk them through it and you pull about the context, and at the end of this counseling session, they're like, you're right, I didn't actually do anything wrong. I get it now. And the next week they come back and they're blaming themselves for that again. How many of you have been on this hamster wheel? All of us have been on this hamster wheel. I told you the slideshow is mostly mistakes I've made. I've definitely been there. So some examples of how this can happen. I have heard way too many times from male and female veterans that they have been put in a vice between their sexual values and their job. They have been put in a situation where I will only let you keep the people in your unit safe if you sleep with me or provide some kind of sexual favor that you don't want to do. You notice the core of this is a moral dilemma. It's not that there was a right or wrong thing to do. Most of you are aware that, like, if one of the options is to report the sexual harassment, sexual assault, whatever's going on, how long it takes to get that through channels and what the odds are of a good outcome. If, you know, the first time I heard one of these is we don't have gun turret shields. We're on supply runs without gun turret shields. A lot of people in my unit are sitting ducks without gun turret shields. I don't have 3 months to file a complaint against the supply sergeant. People are gonna die if I file a complaint. I can save the people in my unit if I save up the supplies. This is not a good place to be. Anybody who has worked with veterans recently has heard the stories about vulnerable people, infants, children, elderly people, disabled people thrown in from the convoy. The only reason you would do that is to try to stop the convoy so you can attack it. So the convoy drivers have a choice between kill or maim a vulnerable person that my values say I'm supposed to take care of vulnerable people, but many people are in the military because they want to take care of vulnerable people. I have the choice between that or potentially having 100 people in my convoy behind me killed. You see that this is not right or wrong, this is moral dilemma. From the enlisted side, the moral dilemma is, do I do what is best for me? Do I do what keeps the people in my unit safe, or do I follow orders that are working on keeping a larger group of people safe, but I don't know anything about those people, and I may or may not trust that the command structure is thinking about. Again, there's a dilemma. Other side of the same coin, and I've had these folks in the same group, the commander who has, okay, there's only one battle plan that takes this situation out. And I know how to do that battle plan, and I know who to put where. And whoever I put there, they're gonna die. And I've got to put somebody there. Because if we don't take out that machine gun nest, a lot more people are gonna die. And then the overwhelmed medic, the military medical professionals, and quite frankly, at this point in history, civilian medical professionals get this a great deal. I have more people than I can take care of. The combat medic, there were 30 people down. If I can get them stabilized and on the chopper in 30 minutes, they're probably going to make it. I'm one medic. I got 30 people to stabilize and get on the chopper in 30 minutes. That isn't going to happen. The important piece to take from this slide is they aren't right, wrong choices. They are consistently moral dilemmas. They're consistently places where there's more than one set of moral rules and they are in conflict with each other. So that is a piece that hasn't necessarily made it very well into the moral injury research literature. That comes more from my clinical experience. But my clinical experience tells me that if I'm working in this way with the client, I get much further than if I try to talk with them about right and wrong. So here's what the literature says. Here are the textbook precipitants for moral injury. Doing something that violates your moral code, watching somebody else do something that violates your moral code, feeling helpless to address a harmful situation, or being betrayed in some way. And you can see things about that that relate to the incidents. For example, being betrayed with the military sexual trauma, pieces of things. Seeing somebody do something that violates your moral code if you don't trust your command when your life is in danger. So there are parallels to all of these. A lot of people will ask me, probably not this group, but a lot of people ask me, why have you dedicated your career to treating something that isn't even a diagnosis? Well, the main reason is because veterans are dying from this stuff. There's new research now that shows that male veterans in particular are at up to double the risk of suicide if they have moral injury syndrome compared to their peers who do not have moral injury syndrome. So I can't wait for this to get into the diagnostic and statistical manual. People need help with this right now. Another consequence of moral injury syndrome is reduced mental health resilience, which essentially means they need more treatment for the same symptoms to get over them than people without moral injury syndrome. And when I say more treatment, there's literature back as far as 2004, Fontana and Rosenheck, that show that individuals managing spiritual distress, was how they defined it, were often in treatment decades longer than their peers who did not have spiritual distress. And then loss of social support. So I talked about, I lose trust in self or others, and I start pulling out of my social support system right away. And there goes one of our best tools for helping them to get better. So let's talk about multiple moral contexts. This is going to be a place where the chaplains in the room will take one look at that slide and they will instantly understand what I'm talking about and be ready for me to move on. My experience is when I'm working with mental health providers, they do not instantly understand this. So bear with me while I explain it a little bit. We grow up with this set of civilian rules, ideas, laws, right? We know what to expect civically. Some of us grow up not only with like our civic and social laws, etc., but we also grow up with a set of religious ideals that may be stricter than our civic social laws. So we're running around carrying around two different moral codes in our head. Then we're deployed and the rules are the rules of engagement. So I've got three moral codes running around in my head. Sometimes it gets really complicated if you go to like a country that's predominantly a different religion or has a dramatically different moral culture. Sometimes there's 4 or 5 moral codes in the room that people are sorting out. It puts people in a vice. You cannot do the right thing based on all of the different moral codes in our head. We do not leave our childhood, young adult moral codes in the kitchen when we go to combat. We're trained in the rules of engagement, but those are still in there. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So here's this next line, the chaplains will say, yeah, I've seen this before. Everybody else, bear with me. So young adults deployed to combat, we expect developmentally to be at Fowler stage 3 of psychospiritual development. And at Fowler stage 3, I know the rules. I know what's right. And I know what's wrong. And if I'm confused about what's right and what's wrong, I know who to go to ask. And as long as I do what people tell me is the right thing, I'm okay. These folks do not have a lot of tolerance for ambiguity, and they don't have a lot of experience with ambiguity. And then you go to combat. and you're stuck in the vise of many different moral codes at the same time. At Fowler 3, we cannot put these into good, bad, right, wrong boxes. Stuff starts to fall apart very quickly, and this is where the assumptions just shatter under the house and things fall in. So the way out of the trap is to push that person's level of psychospiritual development to Fowler 4. And at Fowler 4, people start asking questions about, well, why does that scripture say that in that culture at that time? And does it mean something different there than the same words would mean here right now? Why does this same person in the scripture say this here and say something that sounds like the opposite of her? These are not convenient members of your parish. They ask you hard questions and they pull apart your homilies and sermons. But they're in a better place psychospiritually. And we'll get to some more of the empirical research about this, but building spiritual strength is founded on the assumption that the route from Fowler 3 over what many psychospiritual developmental theorists refer to as the wall, kind of like the 20-mile point in the marathon. If we can get them over the wall from Fowler 3 to Fowler 4, that gives them tools for thinking about their experiences such that they can live with themselves and be in relationships again and move forward with their life. Some people, when I talk about that, get confused and think that what I am saying is that theologically conservative people are at Fowler 3 and theologically liberal people are at Fowler 4. That is not what I am saying. I want to be really clear about this. The idea of being at Fowler 4 is a different process for making moral determinations. There are lots of people at Fowler 4, 5, etc., who come from conservative faiths. The process is to look more at context rather than simply have a memorized code. Fowler 3, there's a memorized code. This is what's right and what's wrong. Fowler 4 is, okay, here's the general principles that matter. This context matters. This context matters. This context. Does that make sense? Yes.
Can we ask questions now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so have you ever come across anyone on the spectrum that is maybe what we used to call Asperger's? And have you been able to help them through that process because of their very literal thinking?
So I can't say that I've spent a whole lot of time with Asperger's disorder. I have a colleague who has done a little bit of work in that area that I might refer you to, named Merritt Kopax.
Okay.
But that's not been part of my practice nor part of my research. Father Joe, you had a
Yeah, I think that even at Fowler 4, have you found that sometimes it's just hard because some things are just so bad.
yeah.
There's just nothing you can do. It's so heavy. It's so sad. You're struggling. Got a good friend, one of my best friends in the book. And we tell this is echo. And I was in charge of his the survey committee with the deacon. And the bishop is a full curl chaplain. And very uncomfortable with the chaplain. Because he's an intelligence officer. And he had to do really bad things. Well, we can make him agree that after he's done with the army sports, and it's very helpful. He has to develop it. And, you know, we started here. We came from the a lot of the army, and we made pretty small and so I was sitting talking to him today, and it wasn't until the PCS that he finally unleashed the moral injury. We literally just sat lunch and we were eating, and he's just like, you know, Joyce, I hate them. I hate all of them. You want to talk about that? Because you're leaving tomorrow. He was literally leaving for PCS minutes. Bro, I've been here 3 years.
Yeah.
I'm just like, well, why? Why'd you just do this to me? You're leaving. And we could have been working with this for 3 years. You know, but we still talk about it now. Hacking. He was just telling me about, for those of you who are GWAT veterans, you might know the term child voice. But, you know, so he was just telling me about how at his level we interact with these guys and I guess it. And it had the war was having boys, they would use for various sexual practices. And he's just like, I don't know how I'm supposed to make a deal with you guys, you're supposed to help us, I want to shoot all of them in the head. And I was like, okay, let's talk about that, you know, we did, we had a good day, we spent hours together that day. He waited until he was gonna leave
Right.
and talk to me, even my best friend in the world.
Yeah.
Why did you wait? I said that was, you can't go, why did you waited to tell me that?
Because if you had rejected him 3 years ago.
Why did you go? Why did you wait to tell me that?
It's not one confession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You leave your worst thing to the end of the confession, so you drop the bomb at the end of the war.
Right.
He dropped the bomb.
Can I trust you this much? Can I trust you
Yeah.
this much?
Yeah.
Trust you that much? Then, yeah.
So,
Maybe he wasn't aware,
yeah,
like, maybe he was finally able to process. Like,
Yeah.
Like, he had, he was away from the situation about him.
Yeah, they didn't fucking leave us. You know?
yeah.
He's at the work on the channel. It was just like, bro, how did you tell me that now? Why did you tell me that 3 years ago? I could have worked on it and then walked together. He was working. Yes, he was.
He was trying to build trust with you so he could actually say it out loud.
He did.
Yeah.
You know, he walked me through some of the targeted. He's just like, you know, like, what if my hand slipped? And like, he was really how I was looking at it. What if I had moves? What if my hand just slipped and they were all fine? I could see better at that, but then we don't have the outlets that we need.
Right.
What if the outlets aren't really good? Like, it's like, oh, why can't we just do this with the bridge? Why do I need these guys? These guys are horrible. Why am I saving? Why am I away from my family? You know, it's like, why? He's in this country that we're saving. He's just not acting looking for a burger. And I was like, I'm literally sitting for a burger talking about this too.
Yeah.
You know? That's really hard.
We're going to talk a little bit about how moral injury can become entrenched, especially if it's buried for a longer period of time. There's some neurosubstrate to that. And another thing we're going to talk about is some of the coping strategies. Moral injury is sometimes used on purpose. Inappropriate guilt is sometimes a coping strategy, and that's why it comes back even after you've done all the cognitive interventions. So we're going to get there. Bear with me. So here's another slide that's just full of mistakes that I used to make. I told you about the categorical versus continuous ideas about what is right and what is wrong. And we need to move people to the continuous. Another thing that is really important to do is how many of you have worked with the 70, 80-year-old Vietnam veteran who was looking back at who he was when he was 18 and judging that 18-year-old from the standards and accrued wisdom of the 70, 80-year-old. They need to be called out on that. And that's pretty much the terms that I'll do, like the empty chair thing, put the 18-year-old in one chair, and the 70-year-old in another chair, and actively have them reconcile with one another. But there's an important developmental context there.
So when you said that, you're basically having the veteran talk to their inner child or to their young man.
Yeah.
And say, hey, you didn't know.
Right.
I mean, you were stupid back
Right.
then. And you had this family garbage going on and whatever. And so, okay.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it in context.
Yeah.
Context is the keys to the kingdom. That's why I shifted my practice so that I practice mostly narrative therapy anymore. Externalizing moral injury. I talked with you about this. There are some diagnostic discriminations that are really important that if you're not aware of, you can mess up your BSS group so that it will be miserable for you and everybody else involved. So people who have externalizing moral injury, these are people who were rule-abiding people. They were like, they did well in school. They didn't get suspended or expelled. They didn't have a pile of juvenile legal problems. And this horrible event happens. Now they're getting drunk and getting in bar fights and picking up Article 15s, and now they're getting all kinds of legal charges. That's what externalizing moral injury looks like. If you have, I was getting suspended in junior high school, I have a bunch of like juvenile legal charges, I was constantly disobeying my parents as a child, etc. That's something on the oppositional defiant antisocial personality disorder spectrum that is not moral injury. I am not saying that these folks don't need treatment and need our support. They very much do. building spiritual strength will not help them. It is not the right treatment for that set of symptoms. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I only know that because I've made a mistake in those folks in my group and the group fall apart.
So just to clarify, it's the past behavior.
Right.
So if they were rule followers, didn't really get in much trouble
Mhm.
and then they
There's
are
a sudden
yeah.
onset.
yeah.
There's a sudden onset of rule breaking behavior because the rules cease to make sense. Yes, Robert?
So, one of the things that Chaplain and I talked about is, deploying this group like in our domiciliaries. So, for example, at Temple, where I am mostly, it's our drug and alcohol recovery, for the domiciliary context, where I would be using this, for example. And so a lot of the guys that are there, I mean, sure, there's undiagnosed moral injury that needs, a deeper dive. I'm working on that with our chiefs. And with our Dom chaplain, like this, now that you're talking about this, there are guys that are there that are obviously there for a reason, right? They're constantly in trouble. They've constantly been back and forth with the Dom, right? They have drugs, alcohol, all those things, And so if I did this class there in the Dom, do you think this would work for the people that are still dealing with their military stuff while dealing with the coping mechanisms of drugs and alcohol?
So first of all, I've done BSS in a dome. So it can work there. There's some ifs, ands, or buts. Before you put people in the group, and we'll talk about this, Drew and I are going to role play this. You do the preliminary interview first to find out what's going on. If they've got that longer term history, they need a different intervention. If there was an event and everything fell apart after that event, they need to go into BSS. Yes.
Can I offer some pushback on the, some children act out because they have moral injury. They've been abused or, they've been neglected.
Yeah.
So how do we know the difference?
Ask them about, it's really careful. You don't want to ask leading questions. So the questions that I would ask were about how old were you when that sexual abuse started happening? In what context was that going on? Okay, and then I go to take like the school history is where I find out a lot about the conduct history. And I'll ask a question, what grade were you in when you started having trouble getting along with teachers? If they line up, you have childhood moral injury. If they don't line up and there was a bunch of rule challenging behavior and then there was abuse, then you've got something else. And again, that is a person who needs treatment and support, and this is the wrong treatment for them.
Thank you.
Can I?
Yeah.
Paul, I want to make sure you're included in any discussions or questions. Did you have any questions or anything that you wanted to bring up?
That's fine. No, that's fine. I'm soaking up the information.
Okay. All right. Well, if you have a question or comment, just pop up on the chat or raise your hand or whatever. We'll make sure you get a chance.
Great. Thanks very much. Much appreciated.
Okay, go ahead.
So I want to talk a little bit, I promised you I'd talk about how moral injury sometimes gets entrenched. That you'll have people who tell you, I know my fault, and every session they're still coming back reporting inappropriate guilt. That's because the inappropriate guilt serves a function for them. They wouldn't be returning to it if it wasn't doing something for them. That's why they can't let it go. So I joke around with my veterans that you've got a teddy bear that's stuffed with razor wire. It's making you feel better short term, but if you keep hugging that thing, you are going to lead to death. This will kill you.
Yeah, good.
So an example, I think this comes up on another slide, but I think I can, if I bring it up now, it'll make sense to you really quickly. When people start reporting inappropriate guilt to me, I used to do the reassurance pat on the back, you're a good person thing. That's like B.F. Skinner giving the rat an extra sweet pellet. Sadly, it's an allegory to dialectical behavior therapy. Marshall Linehan, who grew up suicide attempt after suicide attempt in mental institutions, would say, when I would make a suicide attempt, it was effective communication behavior and people would wrap their arms around me and help me. But I knew the next time to get help, I'd have to make a worse attempt. So if we just provide the pat on the back, the reinforcement, the reassurance, there's a place for that. But that alone can actually increase the veteran's risk of winding up in suicide. So I don't do that so much anymore. Now what I do is I get really curious and use this innovative approach. So tell me about, there was a point in your life where this guilt bomb just went off and like destroyed everything about your life. Is that what happened? Yes, ma'am, that's what happened. I always tell them they don't have to call me, but they do. Like, so what was happening when the guilt bomb went off? So typical kind of story that I'll hear. Sam and I signed up for the Marines on the buddy system. We were in the same platoon together. We deployed to Vietnam. We were side by side on the firing line. And at some point in that first battle, I realized that Sam was dead. Okay, so talk to me about how you felt before that guilt bomb went off. You knew that Sam was dead, but the guilt bomb hadn't gone off yet. What was going on during that time? I was panicked. I was so terrorized. I didn't remember where I'd packed my ammo. I was losing track of fire direction control. I was one sucky Marine in that period of time. What happened after the guilt started? I realized it was my fault Sam died because I wasn't using my combat skills again. You hear the logical flaw in that, right? I wasn't using my combat skills enough. That's why Sam died. So I vowed at that moment that I would always use my combat skills to the best of my ability, and that will keep people in my unit from dying. You hear the logical flaws, right? Yeah. Do you also hear that that kept that person together through their deployment? That's why they hang on to that teddy bear. For some people, that teddy bear is other blame. It's all the CO's fault. I can't bear for any of this to be my fault. I can't take that responsibility because my ego is too fragile and I'm worthless if I've done anything wrong. But that CO, that's him, or the US government, they need to have somebody else to blame. So there's a coping function. This is a way people feel like they take control over their world by blaming self or blaming others. And we got to relieve them of that to help them let go of the symptom. Yes.
All right, thank you. I have two questions. One is, do you work with people where it's more of an accumulation? So it's not one specific event or guilt bomb, but it's just the accumulation and then maybe a realization that might be triggered by an event or otherwise?
So here is what I see in my clinic. I ask people when you're going to refer someone, was there a defining morally injurious event? Or was there a series of events, and does this person use guilt as a coping strategy about a number of events throughout their lives? If we're seeing this as a coping strategy over a lifelong period of time, we are likely looking at a personality disorder. And I refer those patients to dialectical behavior therapy rather than BSS. Their outcomes are better in dialectical behavior therapy than in BSS. Because what that is sort of an access to coping strategy that has been adopted as a character trait rather than one sudden, this has challenged my values and changed how I live in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, that's a great question. Oh, my second question was, I understand where you don't use the right wrong language, but the example of the military sexual trauma, clearly there's a
wrong,
an immoral environment in which things are, they reoccur. And so I guess, how does that land when people are also navigating not just different contexts, but contexts that are oppressive or that need to be changed?
I use wrong language for betrayal trauma. Mm-hmm. If somebody was treated inappropriately, sexually assaulted, put into dangerous duty because they wouldn't do sexual favors, etc., I flat out use wrong language, and everybody else in the group will too. It's appropriate in that situation.
So, I know she had a question, sorry.
Just to kind of carry on what Christine was saying, I know it little moral distresses can turn into one big moral injury. Is that correct? I just want to make sure I'm on the same.
I think that they can. My impression is that building spiritual strength, building spiritual strength works best for people who have a discrete, my life makes sense, this happened, my life doesn't make sense anymore. If we are looking at a developmental, a bunch of things went wrong, particularly when I was a child, that I think the jury's out as to whether we call that moral injury or a maladaptive coping strategy or a personality disorder symptom. I don't think we have enough empirical data to fully define that. So I'm going to try to be really clear today, what's from my clinical experience and what's from my empirical research. From my clinical experience, those folks do better in treatments for personality disorder. The one, if it's been a bunch of events that have shaped them from the time they were 3 or 4, yes.
Oh, were you asking from the time that they were 3 or 4, or like at an employee location, there's a lot of moral distress?
I mean, it can come from childhood or in the military. I have both.
So
I
we-
was wondering if that,
Yeah.
that moral distresses can lead to almost like the person has PTSD, like an event will happen and they have this big, but because of all those little things that came about or happened to them or whatever, and then they experienced this and was like, oh my God, their eyes were open to whatever, right? So it's like having that aha moment. But do I don't know from my personal self, but do I, and it helps me to facilitate when I talk to different people in the care facilitation with moral injury also.
Right.
But understanding it from a self perspective first, then I can kind of, okay,
Yeah.
great. So, you know, but those little moral distresses, like again, I said, I understand it to know it where these can happen. It can be little moral distresses, things that can help you, you know, like you said, they may develop a part of that as a character or a part of their characteristics, but also just they haven't gotten to a place where it developed into a moral injury because they got some help, whether it's through childhood or military or whatever.
The other possibility is there is no rule saying that you can have one and only one of these diagnoses.
Okay.
So my experience with that though is for folks who have been coping this way since they were little, they don't have alternative ways to cope. And sorry, I'm tripping over my language today. And because they don't have alternative ways to cope, it helps them to get into something like dialectical behavior therapy first, and then do BSS. Because that way they will be able to respond to BSS by reaching out and trying all the alternative coping strategies that they've learned in DBT. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So,
yes.
We talk about guilt. Where you said that, guilt was serving a purpose for a time, and now we need to help them let go of it. Right. Does fear work the same way, or is that a different? So there's some fear that something happened, created great fear, then they held on to that fear, they experienced it consistently. Exactly. And it was serving some purpose.
The teddy bear stuffed with razor wire is a terror management strategy.
It's a terror
management strategy. Yeah. I've had a lot of people say, wait, don't we focus on the guilt when we're treating moral injury? And I'll often tell them, we need to focus on the fear too, because sometimes the guilt isn't real guilt. And what we need to do is treat the fear. So one of the cool things about BSS is early in the protocol, people have some very real experiences of sharing the love of a higher power with one another in the group. And that gives them an alternative coping strategy. And that's what gives them the power to get up the teddy bear that's stuck with razor. So we've bounced ahead a little bit in the slides. So when I skip slides, know that they just came in with this slide. So we already talked about these Yeah, we've covered this except for two things. So externalizers. They don't trust authority. They have good reason not to trust authority. No matter how hard we try, if we are providers, we wind up in the authority role. So I'm always telling my folks with, especially externalizing moral injury, but my clients in general, I'm Irene, please just call me Irene. And don't have to be Dr. Harris, etc. I used to work with a Greek Orthodox chaplain who would come into the BSS room, sit down and pull his clerical collar off and say, I'm just Orlando today. I'm not saying you have to do that. I'm saying it is one thing that has been done. These folks fear authority. So there are some special techniques that Drew will help me show you later. One of them is to be very recovery oriented. I am not here to make you do anything that makes me fun of the number of times I say, I'm not your mom and I'm not the police. I'm not here to make you do anything. They start saying it with me about 3 sessions into group. If you want in the BSS group, let's talk about doing that. If you don't think it's for you, I have no investment in you coming into this group against your will. On what works for you. If you want to talk to me today, the door is right there. I'm not making you do anything. By the way, I was seasoned in doing work with these kind of folks, both as a junior high oral teacher, taming junior high players, and then I worked for 2 years in a maximum security state prison.
These are not the same.
There are some developmental commonalities. So there are 2 interventions we use to help bring along the externalizers. One of them is the recovery-oriented intervention. You're in charge of your care, you're the expert in you, I'm not here to make you do anything. The other is the paradoxical intervention. So that is, when I was taming junior high choirs, for example, 7th grade, Johnny's playing the bass drum way too loud in this section. And I know what is going to happen if I said, Johnny, measure 17, make that a little quieter. He's going to break the freaking drum head if I do that, right? So what if Johnny, measure 17, that's not enough. I mean, break the drum head. Come on, give me some more. That's so forth the next time again. So that's what we want to do with our externalizing moral injury folks. So let's say that Dan is my externalizing moral injury person in group. When I go to assign homework, so for this coming week in our prayer logs or meditation logs or reflection logs, whatever you like to call them, what I'd like us to do is XYZ, except Dan, that might be too much for you. I don't want you to try this unless you're really, really sure you're ready, okay? Now, I've done 2 things. One, he's afraid of me. He doesn't believe that I've got his best interest in mind. So he's wanting to do the opposite of what I ask him to do. So I've now given him permission to do it by telling him not to. And the other thing I did was I threw my dog. I don't think he can.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right.
So those are things, that's the only thing left on this slide that we haven't gotten to in our discussion. You guys are really, really good at like moving us ahead quickly with discussion. We are about to move from theory to empirical research. Does anybody need like a 5-minute breather between topics?
Yeah, I'm gonna refresh.
Okay, let's take, so you come back by 11. Does that work? 11, I'm gonna go by that.